So with Marvel's Cinematic Universe being one of the most successful franchises in the world, and now Fox is getting on the action as well, combining both their X-Men and Fantastic Four franchises to one shared universe, not to mention obviously DC doing the same thing. Recently Sony have come out and said that they want to actually create their own Spider-Man universe. However, Sony actually only own the rights to Spider-Man and characters that are directly related to Spider-Man. So how could actually a Spider-Man shared universe work? Now, there's some difficulty in regards to the rights with certain characters. And it's a little bit muddy about which rights to which characters actually fall where. Take, for example, the Punisher, who actually originally appeared first in an Amazing Spider-Man issue. However, his rights are with Marvel, so it's not always the case of which character appeared in which comic first, as I've just demonstrated. However, I think it's a fairly good bet that's probably where to start. Now, if Sony were to create a sort of Spider-Man cinematic universe, I don't think that they would really make films about villains, to be quite honest. I also don't think they'll make films about alternate reality Spider-Mans. I just think that will be too confusing for the general sort of movie public going. So I don't think you'll see like a Miles Morales or a Spider-Man 2099 movie. So I've come up with maybe a list of possible scenarios where they could spin off Spider-Man characters that maybe could go off into their own films, where I feel the rights may still actually be with Sony, although I don't know that for sure. So let's get on with the list. Now I'll start with the most likely sort of suspects and kind of go down to which I think is going to be the least likely. So my first on my list is probably going to be no surprise, and that's going to be Venom. Now Venom is probably the most villainous character on this list. However, he has had, you know, a fair few arcs where he's actually kind of been a sort of quote unquote sort of good guy unquote, and you know he's kind of had this sort of lethal protector thing going on for a good portion of his kind of career. So he's kind of an anti-hero more than anything else. So I think he's probably the strongest contender to have a kind of spin-off, if you like, because he can be a kind of adversary for Spider-Man, but he can also sort of go off and do his own thing and actually have a kind of you know, his own story. Unfortunately, mainstream audiences simply won't get behind a straight villain story, I don't think. So I do not think the studio will risk making a film like that. And you've got to think like that. You've got to think these studios are going to be thinking as a business plan. So what will make the most money? What will be the most popular? And what will appeal to the wider demographic. So probably Venom, because he is a popular character, and that would, you know, he's very obviously tied to Spider-Man. So his rights are going to be very much tied with the Spider-Man franchise, as we've seen from the Sam Raimi Spider-Man 3 movie. Number 2, Morbius the Living Vampire. Now, the reason why I say Morbius as my number 2 pick is because he's already apparently going to have a very small cameo in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Which basically confirms that his rights are still with Sony, and obviously they are kind of introducing him as a character. The other reason I say that is that, like Venom, he's both a kind of a villain and a hero. He's been both, or, you know, again, an anti-hero. So he can have this kind of story which is going to be, obviously, him versus ultimately other vampires is kind of the easiest sort of story to tell with these sort of things. And finally, the last point I'll make with Morbius, he's a vampire. And that might sound obvious, but vampires have traditionally done very well at the cinema. Obviously, you've only got to look for the Twilight series, for example, to see how big these things can get. Now, I'm not suggesting Morbius is going to kind of sparkle in daylight and things like that, but he has crossover appeal to both in non-superhero fans, because they can kind of package it as a vampire film as well as a superhero film. So this is why I've put Morbius as my number 2. Number 3, Spider-Woman. Now, this is one where I'm not completely sure where the rights will stand, because she didn't actually appear in a Spider-Man comic first. She actually appeared in an issue of Marvel Spotlight in 1977. So I'm not sure about her rights, to be honest. I would wager a bet, though, however, her rights are still linked with Sony. I don't know that for sure, but I just think because obviously she's called Spider-Woman, her costume is very much the same as Spider-Man's, even though she really doesn't actually have a lot to do with Spider-Man in the actual comics. I still would bet her movie rights are probably with Sony. And obviously, being called Spider-Woman, again, it just makes that instant recognition brand appeal. You call something Spider-Man, you call something Spider-Woman, it's going to have a very instant kind of connection to that sort of character. And again, I think that's an easy one for kind of mainstream audiences to grasp. Number 4, the Black Cat. So the Black Cat is probably the Marvel equivalent of Catwoman. And again, she's kind of rumoured to be appearing in the Amazing Spider-Man series of films. And once again, she's both been a kind of hero and a villain. She has that crossover appeal where she can do heroic things and have her own story and have her own antagonists where they could build a character around her. Now, this far in the list, I'm thinking maybe they're obviously less likely. But, you know, obviously the Black Cat, she's a very pretty woman. She's got that sex appeal thing going on. She's fairly well known within comic sort of circles. Getting on to sort of the mainstream audiences, they're not going to know her. But if she is introduced in the Amazing Spider-Man series, chances are, obviously, it's a bit easier to spin off. Number 5 is Cloak and Dagger. Now, these two are actually proper heroes. They were never kind of really sort of classed as villains. And they've really done their own thing. So this makes me a little bit nervous whether Sony actually own the rights, because if they did own the rights, this one will be a no-brainer, because it's really just a superhero team they can actually sort of derive straight from without really having to have them be an antagonist for Spider-Man first. Now, the reason why I mentioned Cloak and Dagger, they actually appeared first in Spectacular Spider-Man Volume 2, Issue 64, which came out in 1982, which makes me suspect that they are still, or the movie rights at least, are still owned by Sony. Although I really don't know, because this one, as I say, that really has gone off and spun off and done its own thing. And like I've mentioned, we've had the Punisher. His rights were owned by another company, and then they're now owned by Marvel. And you've also got things like the Black Panther, for example, who were introduced in Fantastic Four, but Fox doesn't hold the rights to the Black Panther, for example. So this one, I don't know. So if they do hold the rights, I think this would be a really good spin-off, because these guys are straight heroes and it can give them a very good sort of in with the sort of Spider-Man cinematic universe. But that's all going to depend on rights of these ones. So next up on the list is the Scarlet Spider. So the Scarlet Spider is essentially a clone of Peter Parker. Now, there's actually been 2 Scarlet Spiders in the actual comics to date, both of which are clones. The Scarlet Spider character would have to obviously link in with the proper Amazing Spider-Man film series. Obviously, you know, you'll probably have to have a Jackal character in there at some point, at least introducing the fact that he's trying to clone Spider-Man to actually make this a spin-off. But you can possibly change his appearance, so you wouldn't have to have Andrew Garfield play obviously the Scarlet Spider. You could just get an actor who maybe looked a little bit like her and say obviously that his kind of DNA has been slightly changed and whatnot. So I think there's a possibility there. The last one on my list, now this is kind of really stretching it a little bit now, but the other one I think it has got a potential of the possibility to become a kind of another sort of superhero movie, is the Silver Sable. Now, she was actually introduced in Amazing Spider-Man 265 in 1985, and she's essentially kind of a mercenary from kind of like a wealthy family who has a kind of like a team of sort of other kind of sometimes superpowered mercenaries, and is basically a gun for hire. And once again, she has that appeal where she's acted kind of against Spider-Man and also in alignment with him. Where you have the Silver Sable and her team, again, it almost makes for a kind of a Spider-Man team movie. Now, in certain iterations, she's actually had Sandman on her team. So, again, that kind of links in with one of Spider-Man's big villains. Like I said, this one's a little bit of a stretch. I don't know, because she really isn't going to be known by anyone sort of outside of who reads comic books, ultimately. However, I do think there is a setup for a potential movie there. Anyway, that's actually my list of the most likely candidates I think that we'll see in a kind of Spider-Man cinematic universe. What do you think of my list? Do you disagree with any of my lists? And do you think there's any characters you think that are sort of better suited to a Sony/Spider-Man cinematic universe that I haven't mentioned? Leave me a comment. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.